thanks to Chris and Alex for that talk just before. That was right up my street. I really loved that. There are so many challenges and opportunities around technology. What I want to talk about is the challenges and opportunities for reflection and deep thinking about the information that we collect and the technological and cultural and economic factors that influence those. Hilariously, I don't actually remember this, but apparently the principal said that you don't need to remember anything anymore. He's not here, I think, anymore, so I can safely try and challenge that as I go along. So my research project I called Blended Memory to indicate the inseparable integration of internal and external processes and information in the way we remember our lives. I don't think that there's a very clear distinction between biological memory and external information, because biological memory doesn't work in isolation. Whoops, we've gone automatic. Doesn't work in isolation of the external environment and context, and we need those to reconstruct memory from our current perspective to make it make sense. What I want to argue for is that blended memory gives us a way of looking at the balance between external and internal information, slow and fast time, collecting new information, and reflecting on what we've already got. So my research is about digital photography and memory, and it's a great topic because photography is huge at the moment. We've become an image culture. Selfie is the Oxford Dictionary's word of 2013. I think I actually saw a selfie taking place in the background of Alex's video. Did anyone else see that? Yeah. 3 world leaders took a selfie at an event to commemorate Mandela the other day and sparked a big debate around what's okay to photograph, what's not okay. And the practices and the conventions and the cultural sort of acceptability of these behaviours is changing really rapidly, and I think it's important that we consider the effects that this has on the way that we remember. If we're taking more and more photographs, do we come to remember not the personal meaning that we derive from each experience, but the contents of our photo collections? So normally when I talk, I would be talking about this balance between episodic and semantic memory, but that's a little bit off track for today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk from the point of view of reflection. And by reflection, I mean thinking about how things connect to what we already know. So rather than collecting new fish all the time, we spend a bit of time thinking about the fish that we already have in our fish tank. This is the end of the fish metaphor, so I hope it's been worth putting that slide up, and I hope you've understood what I'm saying. But basically, reflection takes time, energy, engagement, and sustained attention. And I realized this morning that I'd made a bit of a strategic error in doing a talk that's essentially a way of talking about paying attention, because everyone here already, I can see your faces looking at me, you're already pretty good at this, and if you're not, you probably won't be listening anyway. So I've made an error, but we'll push on. In thinking about how photography has changed over the years, in 1990, so I'm not going back too far, but 1990, it was pretty typical to wait a couple of days for rolls of 24 or 36 exposure films to be developed. You get them back, you might go through them, you might put them in a box, you might put some of them in an album that you would get out when people came to visit. By 2006, digital photography had become bigger than film. Typically, photos sat in unorganized folders on a hard drive or are still on the camera. And a lot of reviewing of these photos was done around a desktop PC in a home office or something like that. By 2011, more photos were taken on mobile phones than on standalone cameras. Almost 400 billion photos were taken that year. And 100 billion of these were uploaded to various photo sharing websites to be viewed by slightly strange and ambiguous audiences made up of friends and family and acquaintances and strangers across the planet. So all of this photo taking and all of this sharing, how does it relate to the individual? Will we become dependent on photography and photographs for remembering our experience in the same way that many of us have become dependent on calculators and spell checkers? Linda Henkel recently showed that taking a photograph of an object impairs your memory of the details of that object if you don't review the photograph. So does that matter? I mean, an important question is, does it matter whether we can remember things without photographs and without external aids or not? And the principle seemed to suggest, although I don't remember him doing this, that it doesn't matter too much. But I would argue that it does, because although with calculators we can do more complex and faster calculations, and spell checkers seem to have improved the spelling in the documents that we read, I would argue that there's a reason why doing memory the hard way is more important than being able to do long division, for example. And that's because if we don't reflect on our personal experience and our events, then it's difficult for us to learn from them and to kind of evolve our identity and our goal systems in the same way. And the other problem is that I'm not sure how much we really are looking at our photographs relative to the amount that we're taking. So to look at this, I decided that I wanted to look at a personally meaningful event where people would take lots of photographs and they would have reason to share and discuss those photographs. So I chose a wedding, and I interviewed 6 people about a year and a half after the wedding in front of their photographs to see what photographs they'd taken, how they'd come to have those photographs, what they'd done with them, what kind of practices and engagement emerged, and what were the technological, cultural, and economic factors that underline that behaviour and that engagement. So I'll just share some insights that came out of that project before trying to connect them to a kind of wider higher educational context. So the first thing that I noticed was that there was a lot of photography. So I interviewed 6 people, and from them I collected over 4,000 photos of this one day. You can see on the top excerpt that there was a lot of stuff. You assume most of it's going to be rubbish. The middle one, you're clicking almost at random. The bottom one, which was actually the professional photographer, took 2,200 and was actually the only participant in this study to have deleted any photos, despite there being photos of like a hand in front of the camera and the floor and some really strange and potentially inebriated behavior. So we see that people are not being hugely selective. And that's something that we can see in other contexts as well. So something that's been receiving a lot of media attention recently is this phenomenon of people recording live music events on their mobile phones in such a way that they disrupt the actual experience that they're trying to preserve. So there's a lack of selectivity in what we capture, and possibly a lack of critical thought about why we're doing this. What's the result of all of this capturing? In the case of the wedding, and I would argue in a wider context, there's quite a lot of saturation and engagement. So you can see the top one says, I got bored. The second one says, I got photoed out. The third one says, skip, 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 all the same boring crap. The top 2 are the people who actually got married. And the bottom one is a really good friend of theirs. So you can see that potentially there may have been too many photographs taken of the day. What did people do with those photographs? Well, there were things that they did, but they only ever did these things. They only ever organised their photos or looked at them when there was some kind of trigger event, and it was always a social trigger event. So the top one talks about a party which formed a deadline for them to organise their photos into a slideshow so that they could show everyone who wasn't there what had happened. The bottom one is talking about labelling photos only when they're specifically being sent to someone else. So these were the only times that people really engaged with their photos after the wedding. If there was no trigger event, what happened was not a lot, really. So, I should get around to deleting them. They offered to make me a book. I wanted to do it myself, haven't done it. The thank you cards took 9 to 10 months. So they decided to put some photographs of the people who went to the wedding in their thank you cards, which was a great idea, but because there was no specific deadline to that, it didn't form a very strong trigger event, and so it took quite a while. And this middle extract always makes me feel really guilty, because I got married about 3.5 years ago, and I haven't quite got around to making up our wedding album yet. So I think, I don't know how many people that kind of feels, relevant to, but I suspect it's a fairly common phenomenon. This one will get a little bit more complicated, but the top excerpt we're looking at Flickr, the second one is Facebook, and the third one is face-to-face. So in the top one, they used Flickr as a sort of broadcast model of communication where they didn't know, and in this case, they didn't care who'd actually received or understood their communication. The Facebook, this comment is talking about, it refers back to what Alex was talking about, and Jared Lanier, who said, that interfaces reduce the communication that passes through them. So I would argue that there's also something else going on, which is that with Facebook, you're never quite sure. You've usually got quite a large network, and you're never quite sure who's going to look at a piece of information, and there might be a combination of friends and family from different circles, and it leads to a slightly superficial and sanitized discourse around your personal events. The bottom one here, which was face-to-face, was a sort of a richer way, in this case, for sharing stories. This isn't generality. So you can use Flickr and you can use Facebook in highly reflective ways, and you can sit in your lounge room with someone else and look through a photo album without thinking much about what's in there. But what I do think we need to consider is the wider cultural trends that are emerging from these types of technologies. So I think that platforms like Flickr and Facebook are pushing us towards a kind of more surface engagement with a broader amount of information, as opposed to deeper engagement with fewer bits of information. So what we end up with is more information than we can process. That in and of itself is not a problem. What is a problem is if we don't have strategies to deal with that. And I think part of our issue is that there is a shift in the function of photography from its traditional function of memorial, so preserving the present for future reminiscence, towards a function of communicating the present in the present and then moving on. Again, that's not a bad thing because pictures as communication are great, but what we need to do is have strategies of dealing with the sheer amount and the different types of photos that we have in our memory work. So here we can see that mobile phone pictures were seen as more disposable of the moment, not really there to preserve an event for future remembering. That seemed to be different from standalone cameras at the moment. And also the fact that you can instantly distribute these photographs across the world leads to a kind of more instant communication function, which is different from what we're used to in photo albums, where something was taken, then put away, and then brought out again. So moving across to a more general context, I think the things that I've found in my photograph and memory study crop up in other information contexts. So social broadcasting technologies like Twitter here allow a huge range of individuals to produce individual perspectives, and for each individual to consume all of those individual perspectives from everyone else. And it leads to this sort of compulsion that you should be aware of everything that's going on and that you should be on top of every new thing, and it creates what I call a collection compulsion. And to try and demonstrate this, I recorded some of my own research behavior, online research behavior. And what you can see here is a typical browser window for me, which has loads and loads of tabs opened up with articles that are related to each other. And usually there would be another 4 windows behind that of more articles, because of this kind of Amazon model of if you liked this, then you'll probably like that. And there's a related article to this, and did you know that someone in Uruguay is also looking at this? And you feel compelled, what happens if I miss something? So then I have a tool like Mendeley to keep track of everything. And I'll just show you a quick clip of my Mendeley account of the articles that mention episodic memory. So this is a small subset of what I've got, and it's 322 articles. And note up here, you probably can't read it, but there's a folder called To Read. And there's 2 really funny things about that folder. One is the speed at which it accumulates articles relative to the speed that I get through those articles. And the second is the amount of articles that I don't bother to put in there, because I know that I'm never really going to get around to reading them because that folder is so massive. There's something a bit strange going on in my own head. So this is a graph of PDFs that I read versus PDFs I collect. It was produced through what I call intuitive statistics, which means I made this graph up, but it looks right. And my intuition suggests that collecting more PDFs does not lead me to read more PDFs. It possibly leads me to read less or fewer because of the time and effort that it takes to actually keep collecting. So, take 5 minutes. Oh my God. Okay. I'll get to the good bit of the talk, which is about the positive opportunities that technology has for engaging in deep thought and reflection. I created this picture of Deb Roy, or I didn't create it, I stole this picture of Deb Roy, who used algorithms to analyze about 90,000 hours over 3 years of home footage. And he used that in a process which allowed him to discover the processes that his son went through to learn to say the word water. Sorry. I realise now that I should have just got in touch with Chris and possibly got a picture of his house, which would have been more current. So in Chris's case and in Deb's case, this is quite contentious because you're recording basically everything and you are thinking about different aspects of it from a kind of computational mindset. Well, maybe that might not be fair on Chris because we don't really know what you're doing. Possibly you don't either. But it is a sort of sustained reflection on something that's going on in his life, and arguably the overall project is leading him to think about concepts of surveillance and concepts of identity and all those kind of things. But that is probably beyond the scope of most of us. So Jonathan Harris is maybe a little bit more accessible. His project, he forced himself to take one photograph every day, post it online, and that forced him to reflect about what was important. He had to be selective about what photograph he chose to represent, and he came to understand the way that his life was being constructed through photography. Memory maps are interesting to me because this is a photograph of a community in Northern Ireland, and it has hotspots all over it which have bits of personal narrative, links to further information, other photos, so there might be photos of that house hidden in the hotspot of the house, and you can actually link to other memory maps to create what's really a really engaging way of browsing through your photographic archive. Within the educational context, what can we do as providers of education to encourage our students to think critically about the media that they're using and the information that they're collecting? One way that we might do this is through encouraging multimodal assessment, which encourages those students to use the tools that are being produced in ways that creatively engage with the information that they're collecting, forcing them to think about how image and text and video, animation, sound all relate to each other, and how a thing is dependent on its component parts, and the meaning of that thing is more than the sum of those component parts. It forces them to reposition the notions of reader and author, and to some extent the notion of assessor and student. So it kind of allows them to harness the creative potential of new tools, figure out a purpose to attach the information that they're collecting to, and basically make a coherent whole out of lots of disparate types of information. As individuals, basically selection, reflection, and engagement are up to us as individuals. There are types of things that we can do, so I can give myself a creative project which has strict deadlines that act as trigger events. I can work with other people, which creates social pressure to actually do something with my information. As I'm going through, I can be disciplined and I can note down what that article, for example, has to do with my overall objective of what I'm trying to achieve. I can basically force myself to slow down. I can try to avoid multitasking. Sometimes it's fine, but I should have some space where I'm not multitasking, so I'm only thinking about one thing at a time. And I should allow myself to miss some stuff, and I should allow myself to forget some stuff, because that creates the space that we need for the deep thinking. So I'm not saying that this is all we should do. I think a balance is good, but I worry that cultural trends push us away from deep thinking and towards surface thinking. So the message I'd like to leave you with is that it's not technology itself that's inherently disruptive, it's the culture that emerges around it. So cultures can emerge that push us in a particular way to try and collect everything and not reflect on it, but technology also provides opportunities for creative engagement, sustained attention and reflection.